All right, so today we're diving into a topic that has really shaped our world, profoundly. The rise of terrorism over the past 40 years. We're going way beyond just the headlines,
Yeah.
you know, trying to uncover the events and the ideologies that have really brought us to where we are today. And
Yeah.
you know what? You might actually be surprised by some of the connections that we're going to uncover.
Yeah, it's really interesting how something that seems like, you know, a one-off incident can actually be part of this much larger web of global networks and ideologies and events.
Exactly. So to kind of help us navigate this landscape, which is complex and honestly sensitive, we've got our expert guide here with us.
Yeah.
You're really good at connecting the dots and giving us those aha moments,
Yeah.
that make these deep dives so valuable.
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. We're going to be looking at, the historical context, the major players, and the crucial events that have really fueled this whole phenomenon of terrorism
Yeah.
over the last 4 decades.
Okay, let's unpack this thing. So, starting with the 1980s, you might think of the 80s and you think Cold War, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, that global tension, it played a huge role in the rise of terrorism. But it was also a time when a lot of the seeds of modern terrorism were sown, especially in the Middle East.
Yeah, the Middle East in the 1980s was a hotbed for what we call proxy conflicts, where larger powers like the US and the Soviet Union were vying for influence, and they would support different sides in these regional conflicts. And that created a breeding ground for terrorism.
So it's not just like these two superpowers going head to head, right? It's more like they're playing a strategic chess game,
Yeah.
using other countries and groups as their pieces. How did that actually play out in the Middle East?
Well, take the Iranian Revolution in 1979. This was a pivotal moment. The revolution led to the establishment of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which quickly became a major state sponsor of terrorism.
Okay, so a whole country is now backing these terrorist groups. What kind of impact did that have?
It had a huge ripple effect. Iran's support led to the emergence of groups like Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah is a Shiite militant group that has a very complex role in Lebanese politics and society. They're involved in social services, but they also carried out some devastating attacks.
Hezbollah. That name, I feel like I've heard that. Weren't they responsible for some pretty major attacks against Americans?
Yes, tragically they were. In 1983, they orchestrated the bombings of the U.S. Embassy and Marine barracks in Beirut, killing hundreds of Americans. These attacks sent shockwaves through the world, and they really highlighted the growing threat of state-sponsored terrorism.
It's hard to imagine the impact of those events, especially at a time when the world was already on edge because of the Cold War. And it wasn't just Hezbollah, right? You also had the ongoing Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which was adding to all this turmoil.
Absolutely. That conflict has been a constant source of tension and violence. It fueled the rise of groups like the PLO and Hamas, both of which employed terrorism as a tactic in their struggle for Palestinian self-determination.
So you've got this already volatile situation, right? And then you throw the Soviet-Afghan War into the mix. I vaguely remember learning about that in school, but how did that contribute to the rise of terrorism?
Well, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979 was a major turning point. The U.S. saw this as an opportunity to counter Soviet influence, and they decided to support the Afghan Mujahideen, who were fighting against the Soviet-backed Afghan government.
So the U.S. was basically arming and funding the very people who would later become their enemies. That just seems incredibly short-sighted.
Well, it's a very complex issue. At the time, the U.S. viewed the Soviet Union as the bigger threat, and they were willing to support anyone who opposed them. But this support had unintended consequences. It helped to create a breeding ground for Islamic extremism. And a young Saudi fighter named Osama bin Laden gained experience and notoriety during this conflict.
Wade bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda?
Yes. The Soviet-Afghan War was a training ground for him and many future Al-Qaeda members. It's a stark reminder of how even well-intentioned actions can have unforeseen and devastating consequences.
So these regional conflicts, fueled by Cold War tensions and often entangled with religious extremism, they created kind of a perfect storm for the rise of terrorism.
And this was just the beginning. The 1980s laid the groundwork for what was to come. Terrorist groups would become increasingly globalized and sophisticated, and their tactics would evolve in ways that would shock the world.
So we just left off talking about how the 1980s really set the stage for the rise of modern terrorism. Now let's move into the 1990s. You might remember this decade for the fall of the Berlin Wall, the birth of the internet, and yeah, a lot of questionable fashion choices. But it was also a time when terrorism started to morph into this global threat that we recognize today.
That's right. The 1990s saw this confluence of factors that propelled terrorism onto the world stage. Things like globalization, technological advancements, and the resurgence of religious extremism all played a role.
Okay, let's break that down a little bit. How did globalization specifically contribute to this shift?
Well, globalization led to increased interconnectedness, this rapid flow of information, goods, and people across borders. And this inadvertently created new opportunities for terrorist groups.
How
So
so?
they could more easily communicate, recruit, and move funds across international borders.
So globalization, which is supposed to bring the world closer together, actually made it easier for terrorist groups to operate on a global scale.
Hmm.
What about technology? How did that play into this?
Technology was a game changer. The internet, especially, became a powerful tool for terrorist groups. They used it to spread propaganda, recruit followers, and coordinate attacks.
So it basically gave them a megaphone and a global stage. And, we were just starting to explore this new online world, so maybe we weren't fully aware of the dangers it posed.
Exactly. It was uncharted territory in many ways. And alongside these technological advancements, we also saw a surge in religious extremism, particularly within certain interpretations of Islam. And this ideology, espoused by groups like Al-Qaeda, provided a powerful narrative that resonated with some individuals who felt disillusioned or marginalized.
So you've got this perfect storm brewing: globalization, technology, and a compelling ideology. And at the center of this storm is Al-Qaeda, led by Osama bin Laden. What made Al-Qaeda different from other terrorist groups at the time?
Well, Al-Qaeda, under bin Laden's leadership, marked a significant shift in the nature of terrorism. They weren't simply focused on local or regional conflicts. They had a global agenda. Bin Laden declared war on the West, specifically targeting the United States, which he saw as the embodiment of everything he opposed.
And this wasn't just empty rhetoric, right?
Hmm.
Al-Qaeda proved they were willing to back up their words with actions. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing was a chilling wake-up call.
Absolutely. That attack, which killed 6 people and injured over 1,000, was a clear signal of Al-Qaeda's intent and capabilities. It showed they were willing to strike at the heart of the U.S., and it exposed vulnerabilities in American security.
It's terrifying to think that something like that could happen on U.S. soil. And it wasn't an isolated incident, right?
Hmm.
Al-Qaeda continued to expand its reach and carry out attacks throughout the 1990s.
Yes, their global network grew, and their attacks became more audacious. In 1998, they orchestrated near-simultaneous bombings of the U.S. embassies in Kenya and Tanzania, killing over 200 people and injuring thousands more. These attacks demonstrated their ability to coordinate complex operations across continents.
So by the end of the 1990s, Al-Qaeda had established itself as a major global threat. And tragically, the world was on the brink of an event that would forever change the course of history: the September 11th attacks.
The 9/11 attacks were a watershed moment not only for the U.S. but for the entire world. They exposed the devastating consequences of underestimating the threat of global terrorism. And they ushered in a new era of counterterrorism efforts.
It's hard to believe it's been over 2 decades since that day. The images are seared into our collective memory. But before we dive into the aftermath of 9/11 and the war on terror, let's take a step back and acknowledge that while Al-Qaeda was rising to prominence, other Islamic extremist groups were also active in the 1990s.
That's an important point. While Al-Qaeda may have captured the headlines, groups like Hamas continued to carry out attacks against Israel. And other extremist organizations emerged in various regions, each with their own agendas and motivations. The threat was becoming increasingly multifaceted and decentralized.
So even as the world was grappling with the rise of Al-Qaeda, other forms of terrorism were evolving and spreading. It seems like we were facing a hydra, a multi-headed monster that was difficult to contain.
That's a powerful analogy. And as we move into the 2000s, we'll see how the landscape of terrorism continued to shift and morph, presenting new and even more complex challenges for the world to confront.
Okay, so welcome back to our deep dive into this evolution of terrorism. We've gone from those Cold War breeding grounds of the 1980s through the globalization and tech explosion that empowered groups like Al-Qaeda in the 1990s. Now we're at this world that's been totally reshaped, by 9/11 and that whole war on terror. You'd think, okay, we've learned our lesson right.
Yeah.
But the 2000s and beyond, well, they threw even more curveballs our way.
Yeah, it's a common misconception that after major events like 9/11, the world kind of figures out a solution and the threat just magically disappears. But terrorism, like any complex problem, it doesn't have a simple fix. In fact, the 2000s showed us just how adaptable and resilient these groups could be.
So let's rewind a bit. The U.S. launched the war on terror after 9/11, invaded Afghanistan and later Iraq to try and dismantle Al-Qaeda and prevent future attacks. How did that actually reshape the landscape of terrorism?
The war on terror had a profound impact, both intended and unintended. On the one hand, it did disrupt al-Qaeda's operations in Afghanistan, and it led to the killing of Osama bin Laden in 2011. But it also created some new challenges.
Like what?
Well, the invasion of Iraq, while initially aimed at removing Saddam Hussein from power, it ultimately led to instability and a power vacuum. And that created fertile ground for the emergence of a new and even more brutal group. ISIS. The Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, they just burst onto the scene in the 2010s with a level of brutality that shocked the world. How did they rise so quickly? ISIS was incredibly savvy. They exploited the chaos in Iraq and the Syrian civil war to seize territory, and they declared a caliphate in 2014. They combined brutal military tactics with this really sophisticated propaganda, using social media to spread their message and recruit followers and instill fear.
Yeah, their propaganda videos were horrific, but also strangely effective. They knew how to use the internet to reach a global audience and to kind of project this image of power and inevitability.
Right, and that's a key point. The 2010s saw this dramatic shift in how terrorist groups use technology. They became masters of online propaganda, using social media platforms to disseminate their ideology, recruit fighters, and inspire attacks far beyond their immediate territory.
So they kind of weaponized the internet, turning it into this tool for radicalization and recruitment. And this wasn't just limited to ISIS, right?
No other jihadist groups like Al-Qaeda also adapted to this new digital landscape. They used encrypted messaging apps, online forums, and even video games to communicate and coordinate and spread their message. This made them much harder to track and disrupt.
So while the war on terror focused on these traditional military operations, the enemy was kind of becoming more diffuse, operating in the shadows of the internet. How did counterterrorism strategies evolve to address this new threat?
Well, counterterrorism efforts had to adapt rapidly. There was a much greater emphasis on cybersecurity and intelligence sharing and monitoring online activity. Law enforcement agencies worked to develop new tools and techniques to track terrorist communications and disrupt their online networks.
But it sounds like it was a constant game of cat and mouse. As soon as authorities developed one strategy, the terrorists would adapt and find new ways to exploit technology.
Exactly. It became this race against time, a battle to stay one step ahead. And alongside this digital evolution, we also saw this rise in what's known as lone wolf attacks.
Lone wolf attacks. These are the ones that are perhaps the most terrifying because they seem to come out of nowhere.
Yeah, they are. These are attacks carried out by individuals who are often inspired by online propaganda, but they act independently, without direct ties to any specific terrorist organization. This makes them incredibly difficult to predict and prevent.
Yeah, we saw several devastating examples of this in the 2010s. The 2016 Berlin Christmas market attack, the 2017 Manchester Arena bombing, and so many others. These attacks showed that terrorism could strike anywhere, at any time, and that the perpetrators could be anyone.
Right, it created this climate of fear and uncertainty, and it challenged traditional notions of security. And as if these evolving jihadist threats weren't enough, we also witnessed the alarming rise of a new form of terrorism, right-wing extremism.
Right-wing extremism. This is something that's been getting a lot of attention in recent years. What are the driving forces behind this particular brand of terrorism?
Right-wing extremism is a complex phenomenon. It's often fueled by a toxic mix of ideologies: white supremacy, anti-Semitism, anti-government sentiment, and conspiracy theories. These groups tend to target minority groups, immigrants, and those they perceive as political enemies.
And like their jihadist counterparts, right-wing extremists have also weaponized the internet right, using online platforms to spread their hateful ideology and recruit followers and incite violence.
Yes, online echo chambers and social media algorithms have created spaces where these extremist views can flourish and spread unchecked. And this has led to real-world violence, including the horrific 2019 Christchurch mosque shootings in New Zealand.
It's a stark reminder that terrorism can emerge from any ideology, from any corner of the world. So as we stand here looking back over the past 40 years, what's the key takeaway you want our listeners to grasp?
I think the most important thing to remember is that terrorism is not a static phenomenon. It's constantly evolving, adapting to new technologies, exploiting social and political unrest, and finding new ways to instill fear and disrupt societies.
So there's no easy answer. No silver bullet solution.
Exactly. Countering terrorism requires a multifaceted approach. It requires vigilance, international cooperation, and a willingness to address the underlying social, economic, and political conditions that can fuel extremism. It also requires a commitment to upholding democratic values, protecting human rights, and promoting tolerance and understanding across diverse communities.
It sounds like a daunting task, but one that we can't afford to ignore. You know, we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. from the Cold War origins of modern terrorism to the rise of global networks and the emergence of new threats in the digital age. It's a complex and often unsettling story, but it's one that we need to understand if we want to build a safer and more peaceful world.
I completely agree. Knowledge is power. And by understanding the history and evolution of terrorism, we can be better equipped to confront the challenges it poses and work towards a future where these threats are minimized and all communities can thrive.
Well, thank you for guiding us through this complex and challenging topic. To our listeners, we encourage you to continue learning about terrorism, to engage in thoughtful discussions, and to contribute to building a world where peace and understanding prevail.